So this is a continuation of my previous podcast on Neil Degrassi Tyson. Um, Another problem with Neil Degrassi Tyson is he attacks philosophy. He attacks the idea of a direction to existence, which is very similar to, or a purpose. This is very similar to what I mean by a pre-existential disposition. Um, People think that in order for there to be like a purpose to existence, it has to be universal. Like the fact that he gives evidence like that life doesn't seem intentional because uh, it's so unique, or most of existence is hostile towards life. But that is assuming that existence is not trying to fill out the spectrum of possibilities. So it's not that life should be everywhere, or that everything should be the same kind of life. I mean, if you look at Earth, life doesn't exist where it's likely. It exists anywhere that it could possibly find a niche. Um, and I don't want to get too caught up on that right now. I could give a whole podcast on life, but I want to stick to physics right now. So, I talked in the previous podcast about the problems, conceptual problems with a hidden medium, Einstein's hidden space-time medium. But even before that, there's kind of this idea that we're like a rock flying through space. Like Joe Rogan sometimes uses that phrase, where planets are tracing out like an orbit through a fluid. And it's weird because it's like saying that not only do the planets move in relation to one another, but also in relation to this hidden medium, like an ether. It's like Einstein's space-time is the new ether, in a sense. Alright. And sometimes physicists will respond, even if like the picture that general relativity gives has conceptual problems that aren't conceivable, then the math is what's important. But people, this kind of like, math has this kind of like magic hypnotism that it does on people. They think that it has causal powers, or that it's more than just a description. It looks all exotic, but I mean, equals is still a verb. You still translate all these sentences into words. It's not an explanation. And it's hard to explain that to people. So I also talked about how what it seems like physics is doing now is they're overgeneralizing the method of finding the hidden cause, or speculating about a hidden cause from the external symptoms or the transparent symptoms. Because this model can't apply to trying to explain existence itself, because it's always looking for something hidden that exists, whether it's a hidden space-time medium or a field of quanta like photons or gravitational waves or a being or an animated fluid. It's all just different tricks, different metaphors, different repeating of concepts. It's always hidden. There's always conceptual problems because you still have the same set of issues of what's explaining these hidden things that exist. It's adding another question. So no one's really ever understood anything. All this chatter for hundreds and thousands of years is just people making metaphors that are concealing reality. It's trippy. Like to grow up thinking that somebody knows what's going on and no one knows what's going on. Um, so I want to also touch on, I was talking about how the bottom of existence is hollow, like it's not composed of anything at all. So that also means that there's no electrons going, like in the double slit experiment, there's no electron that goes from one place to the other, like through the slit or not through the slit. So it doesn't really have a position or a direction, really. It's just that you see the end result, the effect. And the reason why there even is a partial definition of symbols, because it's not uncertainty anymore because there's no electron, but the symbols that we extract, they're like partially defined. And the reason why like the symbolic position of an electron needs to be partially defined is because if it weren't, then it would be macroscopic. It would have a surface, and that could be defined relative to another surface, and that's how you could define like a macroscopic position that you could observe. So that's why the position has to be partially defined, or the symbolic position. And that's also why you can't have the direct atomic relations being observable. What else? The other thing is when Neil deGrasse Tyson, when I was talking about in the previous video where he was trying to give an explanation for why all the orbits orbit in the same sense, and I said that you can't get asymmetry for free. First of all, you needed a disposition for why spin gets translated into orbital energy, and why there's any spin at all and in this direction rather than another direction. But you also need to explain why they're all into neat orbits. You also have to explain why there's a pancaking of the cloud. I mean, they just take the analogy of like, say like the planet spins and it becomes more oblate, but they don't have an explanation for that. See, they're just borrowing from a familiar situation and then projecting it onto an unfamiliar situation. And they do the same thing with redshift, where they take like how redshift works, where you have the reddening and the blue shifting of the sunrise and the sunset, and they project it onto distant galaxies as if like they're the same kind of thing. So they presume sameness, and I'm talking about difference because I have a whole worldview that's based on novelty. So it doesn't repeat any concepts, and they're all about repeating concepts. Like the space-time medium is a repetition of concepts, or a hidden being is a repetition of concepts. Even a field of quanta is like based on a gas. So back to the redshift, the idea is that the redshift is positional, and that even like the motion of galaxies within a cluster, that's redshift due to the motion, but that's a perturbation of this positional redshift, and they're intentionally different. So there's no expansion of existence. And when Hubble first talked about an expanding universe, he was talking about they didn't know about the top of existence was in a network of filaments of galaxies, and then like high density superclusters of galaxies, and then they make the walls of these huge supervoids. And also, it is not understood that it's not conceivable to have a linearly finite existence, because you'd have to observe a boundary, and then they will try to do some hocus pocus on you. They'll try to say that it's four-dimensional, and so you can't conceive of the edge. But then they're always trying to, that's one of those examples where they're trying to convince you of something that's not conceivable. And if you throw out conceivability, then it's anything goes. There's no reason why anything should be the case rather than not the case. So you have a much bigger problem. And I also, so we replace this idea of the Big Bang with what I call the Big Bam, which is an eternal repetition of existence and non-existence, where existence is demarcated by experience and non-experience. So existence begins in progress with the first somatosensory organisms, and then it ends when all the primitive organisms die out, and it just starts over in progress. So there's not even really a formation of galaxies. That's all symbolic. So even like when they extract the earlier versions of the universe, a lot of that's symbolic. Like it didn't actually happen. If it happened, it was supposed to happen before the first primitive living organisms that have a somatosensory experience, a nervous system. So the nervous system is like the meanings, and the experience is the symbols. I don't think of it as a causal relationship. They're different kinds of phenomena, and the experience requires non-experience to differentiate between experiential states. Otherwise it would be ambiguous. You could never have a reason for why it's one way rather than another. And so that's a proof of the external world. And also the reverse, you have a problem with experience or non-experience requires experience to break, to disambiguate whether there's existence or there isn't existence. That is, if there weren't experience, there wasn't experience as a symbol, then there would be there would be no rationale for why there would be. It would be suspended whether non-experience existed or didn't exist. So there's this two-way dependence for experience and non-experience. What else? I know I'm jumping all over the place, but this is difficult to talk about. So back to the bottom of existence, which is hierarchically finite, which complements the fact that existence is linearly infinite. This is a symmetrical asymmetry that I talked about before in the previous podcast. So back to the double slit experiment. So I'm going to claim that the actual direction of the electron is actually fixed, because it has to conserve energy, and because there's going to be a recoil of an atom or atoms that is complementing the shooting of the electron towards the slit. So energy has to be conserved. It can't be suspended. So it has to be fixed. The idea is that that's intentionally unknowable, and that it complements another set of phenomena that are intentionally knowable. Okay. People are going to have a problem with that, but I'll talk about that at some other point. Another thing about when I said no asymmetry for free, there's one exception to that, which is three-dimensionality, or when I talked about there's two uniquely opposing polarizations, negative and positive, enfolded in three uniquely perpendicular orientations. And no one can give like a rationale for why that is the case. Why three uniquely perpendicular orientations? All you can do is say you just repeat it. There's nothing you can do. All you can say is, well, there are only three uniquely perpendicular orientations. Anyone that tries to say otherwise is just saying. They can't actually mean anything else but that. And when someone says one-dimensional or 11-dimensional, they're still talking about three-dimensional. It's still three-dimensional on the screen. So, what else? Obviously, the Big Bang is also a metaphor of a cooling fluid. That's another example of repeating concepts. So, I have like a motto I like to say: repeat without repeating. Empirical Taoism. That's the motto of empirical Taoism. So you're using the concept of repetition, but you're not repeating any concepts, including the concept of repetition. And everything within this eternal repetition of existence and non-existence, it's all the intervals are novel, or unnovelly novel, which means that they're all gradual change, like the leaves of a fern. They're intervals of presence and absence, but and they change. Each leaf is different than the next one and the previous one, but they all are changing, but in a smooth gradient. That's the unnovel part. Well, there's also a set of concepts that complement that, are symmetrical asymmetry, which is novel unnovelty, or novelly unnovel intervals of existence and non-existence. So they're repeated, but they're novel in contrast to all the unnovelly novel intervals that occur within existence. So that's why it's called eternal novelty, because it's constantly changing itself. Once the novelty gets old, then it repeats the whole thing. Then unnovelty becomes novelty. And so it's always been happening. This podcast has happened an indefinite number of times. What else? Oh, when scientists talk about superpositions, those are also things that are not real. The symbols give the impression of superposition, but there is no superposition because there is no electrons. There are no electron positions. These are all symbols, which are perturbations in the overlapping direct atomic relations, meaning there are no actual direct atomic relations. And because these symbols are symbols, and there's no physical atom or nuclei or electrons, these need to be explained dispositionally. I talked about pre-existential disposition slightly. There's only really two examples in philosophy where people seem to be talking about something pre-existential. That's Taoism, when they're talking about the way of nature, and Wittgenstein, where he said something to the effect of the nature of space and time can't be contained within space and time. So I'm not even if you think that's a weird idea, I mean, it does have a precedent. Back to the orbits I was talking about previously. The fact that there are no orbits means there are no circumferences, which also means there is no such thing as pi. And when I was talking about the angles, the Planck angles, those angles can't, just like the electron, the symbolic positions of electrons, they have to be partially defined. So do these Planck angles have to be partially defined. They can't be precise, because then you could imagine them, and then they'd be like three-dimensional intervals, like stop, 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 stop. So we can't imagine any of these things. What else? When physicists talk about perturbations, whether atomic perturbations or